Imagine for a moment the chief architect of an imposing Gothic cathedral, a master whose masterpiece, with its ogival arches, celestial stained glass windows, and audacious buttresses, defines a style for generations. Now, imagine that same architect, in a moment of silent confession, turning to you and admitting, with a disconcerting sincerity devoid of any affectation, that he doesn't actually appreciate Gothic architecture. He respects it, understands its complexity and its power. But his heart lies in the honest simplicity of a stone cabin, or the functional elegance of a modernist design. It seems like a paradox, a contradiction in terms that shakes our certainties, doesn't it? Well, it is precisely in this territory of nuances, of apparent contradictions and profound truths, that we find ourselves when exploring the complex and often misunderstood relationship of David Gilmour, the sonic soul and velvety voice of Pink Floyd, with the genre he helped to monumentalize, progressive rock. For millions of listeners, Gilmour is not just a pillar, but one of the patron saints of prog, the high priest of the emotive and atmospheric solo. The truth, however, as is always the case when dealing with art and artists of his magnitude, is far more fascinating, stratified, and revealing. And it is to unravel this mystery, to journey through the mind and soul of one of the greatest guitarists in history, that we are here today. Before we begin this deep dive, this archaeological expedition into the heart of Pink Floyd's sound, I need your help so that our work can continue to reach and inspire more and more lovers of good music. If you value analyses that refuse to accept easy answers and that seek the truth behind the myth, please subscribe right now to our channel, PsychProg. Leave a like on this video as a sign that we're on the right track, and, most importantly, share it with everyone who might be interested. Your help is the fuel that allows us to keep digging for these gems. To understand David Gilmour's unique and idiosyncratic perspective, it is imperative that we go back in time, not just to late 1967, when he officially joined Pink Floyd, but a few years earlier to the Cambridge of his youth. Cambridge in the 1960s was a microcosm of contrasts. There was the gown, the academic community of the prestigious university, a world of intellectual privilege, philosophical debates, and tradition. And there was the town, the city itself, with its working and middle-class youth, who lived a completely different reality. It was at the intersection of these two worlds that the story began. At the Cambridge College of Arts and Technology, two young friends nurtured their artistic passions. Roger "Sid" Barrett, the future and luminous Crazy Diamond, and David Gilmour himself. While Sid was already a magnetic figure, a dynamo of chaotic creativity whose mind seemed a portal to other dimensions, Gilmour was the craftsman, the more focused and disciplined musician. His afternoons were not spent in surrealistic daydreams, but in an almost religious study of the guitar. He would spend hours on end in his room, with a guitar on his lap and a record on the turntable, deciphering, note for note, the licks of American blues masters like B.B. King and Lead Belly. He absorbed King's economy of notes, the idea that a single bend could express more pain and joy than 100 random notes. At the same time, he marveled at the melodic purity of Hank Marvin, of the Shadows, whose clean, echo-laden phrasing were narratives in themselves. This foundation, this deep immersion in the language of the direct emotion of the blues and the well-crafted pop song, constitutes David Gilmour's musical DNA. He learned to express himself through the guitar, not with the complex syntax of classical, music, or avant-garde jazz, but with the visceral vocabulary of sentiment, melody, and feeling. His first notable band, Joker's Wild, was an R&B and blues group, a testament to his devotion to the roots of popular music, playing covers of Chuck Berry and Wilson Pickett in local pubs and clubs. He was, in essence, a working musician, an artisan of sound. While Gilmour honed his craft in Cambridge and on hardscrabble travels across Europe, even busking on the streets of France and Spain with Sid Barrett and other friends in 1965, often for little more than enough money to eat, a sonic revolution was underway in London. Sid Barrett had moved to the capital and joined 3 architecture students from Regent Street Polytechnic, bassist and lyricist Roger Waters, keyboardist Richard Wright, and drummer Nick Mason. Together, they formed Pink Floyd. The sound they created in the epicenter of swinging London was radically different from anything Gilmour was doing. It was the sound of mind expansion, a soundtrack for the psychedelic experimentations flourishing in underground clubs like the legendary UFO Club on Tottenham Court Road. There, amidst liquid light projections, incense, and an entranced audience, Pink Floyd became the house band of British psychedelia. They were the architects of what was dubbed space rock. Long instrumental improvisations, the pioneering use of feedback, Binson Echo-Rec tape echoes, and atonal dissonances. It was music for traveling without leaving your seat. Yet, at the heart of that sonic chaos, Syd Barrett's unique pop sensibility still pulsed. His songs, featured on the first and monumental album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, 1967, were like acid-distorted fairy tales. Songs about gnomes, bicycles, scarecrows, and Siamese cats were portals to a universe of fantasy and childlike wonder. The album is a landmark of psychedelia, a brilliant and ephemeral work of pop art, but it was not yet progressive rock in the sense that the genre would come to be known with bands like Yes, Genesis, or King Crimson. It was pop art in its most hallucinatory state. Gilmour's call-up to the band in late 1967 was not, therefore, an invitation to join an ideological movement or to push their sound to a new frontier. It was an act of pragmatism, an emergency measure born of tragedy. He was the childhood friend, the solid and reliable guitarist who could, initially, serve as support for an increasingly erratic Syd, and soon after, take his place. Syd Barrett's behavior, fueled by massive LSD use and a rapidly declining mental health, had become unsustainable. He would appear on stage with a vacant stare, purposefully detuning his guitar or simply stopping playing in the middle of a song. There are reports that he would crush Mandrax tranquilizers into his hair, which would melt under the stage lights and run down his face. The band was on a tour of the United States, and the situation was a disaster. Gilmour was recruited to be the fifth member to cover Syd's guitar parts and sing when he couldn't. For a brief and strange period of a few weeks, Pink Floyd performed with two guitarists. But the situation was untenable. The famous decision to not pick Syd up on the way to a show marked the end of an era and the beginning of a period of profound uncertainty. Gilmour was not the new Messiah. He was the substitute, the patch, and he carried the weight of filling the shoes of a genius whose absence would haunt the band forever. With Barrett's inevitable and painful departure, Pink Floyd found itself a ship without a rudder in a stormy ocean. They had lost not only their lead guitarist and vocalist, but their creative beacon, their main songwriter. It was in this existential vacuum that the band's journey towards what the world would label progressive truly began. But it was a journey, born of necessity, of trial and error, not of a pre-established artistic conviction. The first album with Gilmour fully integrated, A Saucerful of Secrets, 1968, is a record of this transition. The title track, an instrumental piece of nearly 12 minutes, is particularly revealing. It is a sonic collage divided into sections, a clear precursor to the epic suites that would come. The final part of the piece, Celestial Voices, is dominated by Richard Wright's solemn organ, and crucially, by David Gilmour's ethereal guitar and wordless vocals. It is the first time we clearly hear the sonic signature he would bring to the band, a capacity to create vast soundscapes, focused more on texture and atmosphere than on technical complexity. However, it was on the double album Ummagumma, 1969, that the band dived headfirst into experimentation, and where the first cracks in Gilmour's vision for this path became evident. The album's concept, one live record and one studio record, where each member would have half a side of vinyl to create a solo piece, sounded like an avant-garde manifesto, a declaration of artistic individuality. In practice, however, the project exposed the deep insecurities and different musical approaches within the band. Roger Waters, increasingly conceptual, delved into musique concrète with the bizarre and fascinating several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave and grooving with a pict. Richard Wright, the most classically trained musician, explored his classical piano and avant-garde jazz influences in his four-part suite, Sisyphus. Nick Mason, the drummer, created a percussive and textural collage with flutes and effects in The Grand Vizier's Garden Party, and David Gilmour. His three-part suite, The Narrow Way, is the sonic document of an artist in conflict. The first part is a beautiful acoustic finger-picking piece, reminiscent of British folk. The second part explodes into a heavy, distorted, hard rock riff, a harbinger of the sound they would explore in tracks like The Nile Song. The third part returns to an atmospheric sound with layered guitars and ethereal vocals. Years later, Gilmour would describe with brutal honesty the absolute panic he felt when confronted with the task of composing alone. He openly confessed that he did not see himself as a composer in the traditional sense, and that he spent the entire process bluffing, desperately trying to fill the space he was given. He was a guitarist and singer being forced to assume the role of an experimental composer, a hat that did not fit him comfortably. He felt that the complexity was being imposed, that it was an intellectual exercise, and this feeling of artificiality and pretense would become the core of his critique of the progressive rock label. This tension between artistic ambition and the search for emotional authenticity reached its most critical and controversial point with the next album, Atom Heart Mother, 1970. The iconic cover featuring the cow Lulubelle III already suggested something unpretentious, an anti-design, but the music on side A was the opposite. The title track, a 23-minute orchestral and choral suite, was a collaboration with the avant-garde composer and cellist Ron Geesin, who had previously worked with Roger Waters. The recording at Abbey Road Studios was a logistical and cultural nightmare. The orchestra and choir, composed of formal, classically trained musicians, looked on with a mixture of disdain and confusion at these four long-haired rock musicians and their strange music. Communication was difficult, the scores were complex, and the result, while undeniably monumental and impressive in its scale, sounded to the band itself like a patchwork quilt, something forced. Although today the suite is revered by many fans as a pinnacle of symphonic rock, a landmark of the genre, the band, and notably Gilmour and Waters, in a rare moment of retrospective agreement, came to repudiate it publicly and vehemently. Gilmour, in interviews, went so far as to call it a load of rubbish, and stated flatly that it was the sort of thing a band does when it is desperately out of ideas. For him, the orchestration and the brass and choral arrangements were a gimmick, an external layer glued onto the music, an attempt to appear serious and important in the eyes of the critics, but which did not spring organically from the soul of the band. It was complexity for complexity's sake. It was form over content. And here we arrive at the challenge, the crossroads that would define not only the future of Pink Floyd, but Gilmour's own legacy as an artist. The path of symphonic grandiloquence seemed a dead end, a pastiche. How then to continue expanding their sonic boundaries? How to create epic and innovative music without surrendering to the empty pomp and pretense they themselves were beginning to detest? The answer to this fundamental question would not only save the band from becoming a caricature of itself, but would forge the artistic philosophy that would guide David Gilmour for the rest of his career. The epiphany, the moment of clarity, the discovery of their true progressive voice did not come from a grandiose intellectual concept or a collaboration with a conductor. It came from the purest musical instinct, from the rediscovered chemistry between four musicians in a room. In 1971, during the sessions for what would become the album Medal, the band felt lost again. They locked themselves in Abbey Road Studios, with no finished music, a blank slate. To break the block, they began an experiment they dubbed Nothings. The idea was for each of them to go into the studio and play whatever came to mind, without a predefined rhythm, melody, or structure, and to record these fragments. It was from one of these nothings, a happy sonic accident, that everything changed. Richard Wright was experimenting with a grand piano, and its sound was picked up by a microphone routed through a Leslie rotating speaker, an effect normally used on Hammond organs. The result was a solitary, resonant sound, an aquatic ping that seemed to come from the depths of the ocean. That sound became the spark. From that single ping, the band began to build, collaboratively and organically, a 23-minute sonic journey that would become Echoes. This composition has all the ingredients one would expect from a progressive rock masterpiece. Epic length, multiple contrasting sections, innovative sound textures, an anthological guitar solo, and a lyrical and musical journey from abyssal mystery to transcendence. But the crucial difference for Gilmour and the band lay in its genesis. Echoes was not designed on a drawing board, it was discovered, excavated. It grew like a living organism from the interaction, the musical dialogue between the four. The famous initial ping was not an artifice, it was an invitation to explore. The rhythmic, almost funk section in the middle of the piece, with Waters's pulsating bass and Mason's precise drumming, was not theorized, it was felt. A groove found in improvisation. The seagull sounds were not real seagulls, but Gilmour creating an accidental effect by plugging his wah-wah pedal in backwards. Gilmour's guitar in the piece was not demonstrating technique, it was painting underwater landscapes, dialoguing with Wright's organ, screaming in a cathartic climax, and then retreating into a whisper. It was there, in that process, that they finally understood. True progression, for them, was not about adding layers of orchestral complexity, but about deepening the exploration of space, dynamics, atmosphere, and above all, emotion. With this, master key in hand, we can finally decipher David Gilmour's complex code. He was never against the idea of progressing with music. He was against the caricature of progressive rock, against the clichés that the genre quickly accumulated. He despised what he saw in some contemporary bands as a kind of musical Olympics, virtuosity as an exhibition sport, solos that seemed like mere high-speed fingering exercises, time signature changes that sounded like rhythmic hiccups, designed more to impress other musicians than to serve an emotional need of the song. His philosophy, honed from Meddle onwards and elevated to perfection in masterpieces like The Dark Side of the Moon, 1973, and Wish You Were Here, 1975, was elegantly simple and profoundly rigorous. Technique, complexity, and structure must always be tools in service of a greater master. The song, the atmosphere, the feeling. The music should create a world for the listener to inhabit, not a labyrinth for them to get lost in. His guitar solos are the most eloquent materialization of this belief. In Time, the solo is not a display of speed, it is an explosion of frustration and contained urgency against the inexorable passage of time. In Money, despite the unusual 7/4 time signature, the solo is visceral, bluesy, and direct. And of course, in Comfortably Numb, he is not just playing scales, he is staging a two-part drama, a musical dialogue between the painful lucidity of the first solo and the numb, epic transcendence of the second. Gilmour is, at his core, a storyteller. Each note is a carefully chosen word. Each bend is an inflection of the voice, a cry or a lament. Each pause, each space he leaves between phrases, is a silence laden with meaning, allowing the emotion to breathe and settle within the listener. He is an architect of sonic cathedrals, but his foundations are the blues. His mortar is pure emotion, and his genius lies in knowing exactly which note not to play. And if you, the listener, connect with this relentless search for music that is both intelligent and deeply moving, know that this is the philosophy that guides us here on this channel. Strengthen PsychProg with your subscription and your like, so that we can continue to explore together the true soul of great music, beyond labels and boxes. Gilmour's innate distrust of the genre's excesses and self-indulgence was dramatically validated and reinforced in the mid-1970s. The explosion of punk rock in England was a cultural purge, a visceral, nihilistic, and anarchic reaction against what the youth of the time saw as the complacency, distance, and arrogance of the dinosaur bands of progressive rock. Pink Floyd, with their stadium shows, multi-million-dollar budgets, giant inflatable pigs, and conceptual albums about madness and death, was a prime target of this new and furious generation. The image of Johnny Rotten, the caustic vocalist of the Sex Pistols, wearing a Pink Floyd t-shirt with the words "I hate" scrawled by hand above the band's name, became one of the most potent symbols of that generational conflict. To the outside world, Pink Floyd might have seemed immune, an untouchable entity in their ivory tower of success. But internally, the blow was felt. For Roger Waters, this external criticism was like pouring gasoline on his already burning fire of cynicism and anger against the system. It propelled him to create increasingly dark, politicized, and brutalist concepts, such as Animals, 1977, a fierce critique of capitalist society, and the paranoid rock opera The Wall, 1979. For Gilmour, the rise of punk likely served as a bitter confirmation of his long-held instincts. It reinforced his fundamental belief that music, no matter how grand and ambitious in scale, must maintain a fundamental human connection, a direct, emotional truth lest it become a museum artifact, pompous, self-referential, and ultimately irrelevant to new generations. The deteriorating relationship between Gilmour and Waters throughout the recording of The Wall, and especially during the creation of the Final Cut, 1983, an album Gilmour described as leftovers from The Wall and on which he felt more like a session musician than a band member, led to the inevitable and troubled departure of Roger Waters. The dissolution of the most successful creative partnership in rock history plunged the band into its greatest abyss, a point of suspense and expectation that paralyzed the music world. The question was omnipresent, echoing in every magazine and radio show. Could Pink Floyd exist without its conceptual architect, without the author of its operatic libretto, without its lyrical driving force? Waters publicly declared Pink Floyd a spent creative force and initiated a bitter legal battle to prevent Gilmour and Mason from continuing to use the name. The future was uncertain, and the pressure on David Gilmour was monumental. The responsibility to answer this existential question, not in the courts, but in the studios and on the stages, fell entirely on his shoulders. And his answer, his declaration of artistic independence, was the 1987 album A Momentary Lapse of Reason. This album is the purest and most distilled manifestation of his artistic vision for the band, free from Waters' conceptual tethers and neurotic intensity. Consciously and deliberately, he moved away from lyrical density and political confrontation. Instead, he returned to what he considered the primordial and timeless essence of the Floydian sound, the essence forged in the sessions for Echoes and perfected on Wish You Were Here. The texture, the vastness of the soundscape, the melody that floats as if in zero gravity, and above all, the narrative and emotional power of his guitar. The album is immense, atmospheric, with a polished production characteristic of the 80s, and undeniably progressive in its scale and ambition. But it is a progressive filtered entirely through Gilmour's sensibility. The songs breathe. The solos, as in On the Turning Away and Sorrow, tell stories of hope and melancholy. The production is an ocean of sound, designed for total immersion. Gilmour proved to himself and the world that the sonic identity of Pink Floyd was as much his as it was Waters's, but that his internal compass pointed in a different direction, not towards intellectual confrontation, but towards transcendental immersion. The overwhelming success of the album and the subsequent world tour was his final vindication. At the end of this long and winding journey, the answer to our initial question reveals itself in all its elegant and satisfying complexity. David Gilmour was, indeed, a progressive who was deeply suspicious of progressive. He became, almost by accident, one of the most influential architects of a style whose label and dogmas he often rejected, not out of arrogance or false modesty, but out of a deep and unshakable fidelity to his own artistic truth. He ardently believed in the progress of rock, in its infinite capacity to absorb influences, to use new technologies, to create complex sound worlds, and to tell larger-than-life stories. However, he insisted, with the stubbornness of a true craftsman, that this progress must always be guided by instinct, emotion, and heart, not by a rulebook, an abstract musical theory, or a mathematical equation. For you, who appreciate the mastery of focus, who witness the genius of Jan Akkerman and Thijs van Leer so brilliantly fusing the erudite and the visceral, the classical and the rock, David Gilmour's philosophy is a powerful invitation to reflect. It is a call to look beyond the labels, categories and boxes in which we try to imprison music, and to seek authenticity and truth in every note, in every silence. David Gilmour did not just leave us a legacy of immortal guitar solos. He bequeathed us a detailed map to find the soul within the structure, the pulsating beauty within the complexity, and above all, the profound and resonant humanity within the immensity of the sonic cosmos. And that, my friends, is a lesson that will echo forever, far beyond any musical genre. Thank you so much for your patience, your attention, and for joining us on this truly epic analysis. The exploration of the vast universe of music is a never-ending adventure, and there are still many continents to explore, many mysteries to unravel. If this immersion into the mind and music of David Gilmour resonated with you, if it enriched your perception of this monumental artist, don't let the journey end here. Subscribe now to the Psych Prog channel, activate notifications to be the first to know about our new videos, and dive headfirst into our archive. There is a world of history, emotion, and musical discovery waiting for you. We count on your support to continue this mission. Until next time,